Alright, well, loading Banished again. I think I was about to work on my forestry. I gotta get a forestry going, but I don't really have enough people in this at the moment to I don't really have enough people to make forestry a thing.
Oh yeah.
I need four more people.
Wait, to do what?
Well, to be foresters.
Oh,
But I've got let's see, they've got children. This place has an 11-year-old. This place has an 8-year-old. This place has a 7-year-old. So we don't yet have any working. We're gonna be. Yeah, this is gonna be a little bit tricky because
there's a little girl here staring at the wall and she's saying, "Hey, don't interrupt our conversation."
oh yeah, who's that? Strengths?
No, no, it's a NPC and Pokemon.
Oh,
They were staring at the wall and I went over to talk to them. I said, "Don't interrupt our conversation."
wow.
Having a conversation with the wall.
What the hell?
Yep.
So many people are like this whole idea of interrupting and all this bullshit. There's a whole lot of snowflakes nowadays that don't understand that in a conversation, it's not always interruption. When you're actually having a conversation with somebody and they are engaged in the conversation, it's called interjection. If
Oh yeah.
somebody who comes along from outside of the conversation comes in and starts talking, that is interruption. But so many snowflakes these days don't know the difference between interruption and interjection.
Oh yeah.
And you run into this a lot with people on the left. They're always they feel like what they have to say is so bloody important that nobody dare interject. Fuck.
Oh yeah.
Alright, what are we missing? Do we have any hides yet? Oh good, I can make sweaters now. Okay. Let's get one of these gatherers working in the tailor. Because we're going to be running out of coats soon. Slow gains in the beginning. Okay, so I think I can be harvesting rock. Jeez, this thing is so laggy. I don't know what's going on, why this is lagging so bad. I had 0 lag yesterday. I wonder if I gotta restart my computer. I think I can actually... Oh, I can have 4 hunters? I think I'm gonna go down to 2 fishermen, 2 gatherers, get a 4th hunter. What? Oh, I did that wrong. There we go. Alright. Now I got 1 laborer. Oh, we're getting coats again. Alrighty. And I think I should build a bridge while Okay, we got 11 coats. We'll get rid of the tailor. Oh yeah, I gotta get rid of the rock out of there too. Eventually, we'll have this area cleaned up. We'll get this rock here, and we'll prioritize it. Alright, so by the end of this episode, I think I want to have a forester working. Alright, we've got a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. That's not quite old enough to be having babies yet. Oh, that's the male. It's the female's 12. Who else do we have? So we just gotta wait another 3 in-game years to make another house, and then that'll be a 15-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy having a starting a family.
How is that even possible?
So
I
insane.
don't think that's possible.
What's that?
I don't think that's possible.
That it's possible?
Yeah, the boys should go.
Well, not according to this game.
Oh yeah.
I guess they eat a lot of meat
Mm.
and vegetables. It's that fish diet that they're on. Venison, vegetables, and fish. When people say, "Oh, I like my coffee how I like my women," and I'm like, "What's that? Bitter?"
Oh yeah. Right on.
Oh, okay, we've added a laborer to the pool. Oh, okay, the laborers are added at the age of 13. So 13 is... okay, so I've got to wait another 3 years, and the girl will be 16, and the boy will be 13. As soon as he enters the workforce, we'll build them a house, and they can start their family.
Here we go.
Build that bridge. Oh, I see. I gotta actually get my carpenters on it now. Alright. Booga 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 booga. Those are some old video game sound effects.
Oh yeah.
Sounded like Pac-Man dying. Almost. Like. That's a simile.
That was something the Pokemon was making.
I wonder why they haven't built that road yet. My road builder's slacking off. Ah, there he goes. She. About time. I like how they just divide the work up among the women. Like, you know, like our modern age are so full of snowflakes. Like that they have to have this whole equity nonsense because, you know, the people who forged our countries out of the wilderness, who actually created the U.S. and Canada, they never once did they worry about who was picking at the rocks and digging the whatever it took to get that foundation in the ground, right? The women and the men worked side by side, cutting down trees and shit and doing whatever it took. You know, like both of us, our great grandparents, like I know mine, my great grandfather, he was part of a group that settled the Jarvis Inlet, that homesteaded the Jarvis Inlet after World War One. When he came back from World War One, they homesteaded a region of the coast that was virtually uninhabited. They broke ground. They knew that your home had to be south facing, you know, to make the most out of your growing season. They knew shit back then. That everybody knew that. Yeah. But, you know, like the women were, you know, back then. I mean, and even my great grandfather, him and his wife had, I think, 6 kids before the war. So in the late 1800s, when was that fucking war? Like 1902 or 1910? They were like having kids in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They had 6 kids. And then after the war, when he got home from the war, they had another 6 kids.
That'd be 12 kids.
Yeah, they had massive families. He was 33 when he went to war. But his wife was like they back then. Women were having kids when they were teenagers. Like what we consider teenagers now was considered an adult then. Like you were an adult at the age of 14, 15 in the 1800s. You know, so America was founded and homesteaded by people who were like 14, 15 years old. Some of them were breaking ground and building homes and starting farms and
instead of that, they force you to go to school longer.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, look at how the ease of our existence here now. You know, people don't need to be. There's no call for people to join adulthood until they're 20.
Yeah.
There's really no call for it. Now, where I come from, I was raised in a commercial fishing village, and a lot of my friends were running their own fishing boats at 14.
Oh, yeah.
You know, yeah, 14 years old. My one friend, his grandpa, his grandfather back in the early 1900s built, and that's the other thing. Those guys, they built their own fishing boats by hand. They built it in their own boat shed. They'd build a boat shed. They'd put up a ways with tracks running down into the ocean. They'd build a boat shed. They'd build the boat, and then they'd launch the boat. And that boat shed, in the wintertime, they'd pull their boat out of the water up into the boat shed. So my friend, his grandpa built the boat that his dad ran, His dad ran the boat and wintered it in the old boat shed that his dad had homesteaded the land, built the boat shed, built the boat. His dad was running the boat. And then by the time my friend was 14 years old, well, he fished with his dad all his life on his grandpa's boat. And when he turned 14, he ran his own boat right next to his dad. He'd fish right beside his dad, and they'd go out together with two boats. And he skippered his own boat when he was 14. And he was already, by the time he was 12, he was skippering his grandpa's boat.
I wish I knew how to do stuff like that.
Yeah. But when he turned 14, he was running his own fishing boat right beside his dad. And that's just the way things were around here. And that was in the early 80s. That was in the early 80s. I was kind of jealous of that because my dad, like my grandpa, built his boat too. Like he built his own boat. I think what's the New Dawn was the name. It was an old West Coast trawler. My dad helped him build it. They built the boat shed. They built the boat. Then they launched the boat. My dad grew up fishing on their boat that they built together. And then when my dad was, out of school and he went logging, he was like a logger and a fisherman. And then when my grandpa died, the family had to relocate my nana, so they ended up selling the boat, which is that's a whole nother thing. But they sold the boat. But at that point, I don't think my dad really cared because he was busy logging. I don't know that he really intended to be a fisherman. But then ultimately, my dad wound up being a fisherman. He never took me fishing with him. Never. He never took me fishing. Never taught me how to fish. Never any of that. So I grew up when I was a teenager. I was probably one of the most useless of all my friends. Like I didn't do shit. Like I was living in a fantasy land. I was still playing and like I was very much a kid. I was like 10 years immature. So, for me, I didn't really start working until I was like, I did little jobs and shit like that, but I didn't really know much about work. I spent my life in the woodshed, so like I went and I cut firewood, and I chopped firewood, and I stacked firewood. That was my work experience, was running a woodshed. And which is good work experience in itself, but that's pretty much all I knew how to do. It's all I wanted to do, really. I didn't know any better, actually. And then one day I happened to be over at my friend Andrew's place. He wasn't there. And I just happened to answer his phone because it rang when I was walking past it. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll pick up the phone and I'll take a message because Andrew wasn't there. And it was Andrew's, one of the logging bosses, one of the local contractors. And so the contractor, he's like, oh, yeah, oh, shit. I said, well, Andrew's not here. And he's like, oh, shit, he was supposed to show up. Like, I need him out in Fair Harbor. We're starting this job, and I need him there tomorrow. And I said, well, what's the job? I'm not busy. I'll do it. And he's like, oh, yeah? He's like, okay, well, we're logging. He's like, get yourself out. He says, don't worry about the gear. We'll set you up with the gear for now. But just get yourself out to Fair Harbor. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I wrangled myself a ride, and I got out to Fair Harbor, and that was the beginning of like a decade of logging. And I became a logger. So when I was like in my early 20s, I started logging, and that was my first, what I would say is my first real work experience. Like, I'd worked a little bit in restaurants, and I'd worked a little bit here and there, and I didn't really like working. I didn't like jobs. I didn't like paying taxes. Any of that shit. It all just seemed like being broke all the time on a pittance, like earning some piddly little wage and stuff, never made sense to me. And I realized why. It's because I wasn't really working. But once I started logging, then I was like, oh, this is what it's all about. And
Oh yeah.
well, there they are, 14 and 11, and they're living in their own home. At least the girl's older than the boy. That's a good place to save it. But I still don't have the forest, so I'm going to start building the forest lodge. Whew. But I've always admired my grandpa's generation, my great grandfather's generation, but my dad's generation, I have very little respect for that whole generation of people. Like the bulk of them, like
What generation is that?
my dad's generation, the late boomers, like the second runoff of boomers.
The boomers have become a meme now.
Oh yeah, really seriously, like they basically got handed over the reins to Canada and the US. They got handed over the reins by a generation who showed everybody how to run what they had built, and then only to have like my dad's generation run it all into the ground.
Oh yeah. I mean, I guess the boomers, they kind of created this, or kind of the modern shitty government we have now.
Well, and that was also their parents too. Like I could see how, like I mean, look at the generation that murdered Kennedy. They were already seriously corrupt.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, like, a lot of them were corrupt. That's why the boomer generation wound up so corrupt.
Yeah.
But what you're talking the upper classes. I think that's the difference between the upper classes and the lower classes. Like, because the previous generation, like even the first batch of boomers. The first batch of boomers, most of them were good people, like the working class. I think really where they went wrong was the next was the second batch of boomers were the ones that really dropped the ball. Like, but they got handed everything. Like, they all had like, for instance, the boomers grew up in homes that the mother and father, they had a full family unit. It was that second batch of boomers that started the divorce rate skyrocketing, and and I don't know if it's scientific, but I mean that's definitely the way I perceive it. I'm pretty sure they're the reason why the divorce rates went, and why I was raised in a single parent home. And why our generation, Generation X, when it comes to relationships and family, we really don't know what the fuck we were doing, because we weren't taught how to raise a family. And
Hey, Brad, are you a millennial?
no, I'm Generation X.
Oh yeah, no, I'm Generation Z.
Yeah, there's a whole generation between my generation and your generation.
Yeah, that's the millennials.
Yeah. Yeah, the millennials they're kind of a lost generation. Like, you know how many millennials like I've watched, like, because like how many of these millennials wind up dying of drug overdoses and shit, like self-induced
Oh
drug
no.
overdoses. They have a terrible, terrible outlook on life. They think life is just completely meaningless. They drank the fucking Kool-Aid, hook, line,
Yeah,
and
because
sinker.
that's what NASA wants you to think.
Yeah, they drank the fucking Kool-Aid hard, man. They hit the Kool-Aid hard. They did. They fucking hit it hard, man. And the problem with the millennial is when the millennials were coming of age, the powers that be spiked the fucking lemonade with meth and fucking with some serious fucking drugs.
Oh yeah.
But also their nihilistic attitude, like they're the ones who really drank the whole life is meaningless, we're nothing more than monkeys on a spinning ball rocketing through endless space, and there's no meaning to anything.
Yeah.
They they really had the
It seemed like we're specks of nothing.
yeah, they really, that generation more than anybody had the rug pulled out from under them. But one thing I noticed when, like, when I came of age, like when I was in my 20s, mid to late 20s, I knew that the generation that was starting to come up and being 18 to 23 when I was in my late 20s, that generation was totally lost. But when I looked at your generation, who were all like, maybe 10 years old at the time, I was looking at your generation going, you know what? There's some hope with this next generation coming up after the millennials, because they're all turning out to be super conservative. Like, they don't smoke, they don't drink. They're already 10 years old, and they don't want anything to do with booze. They don't want anything to do with smoking. They, for the most part, they were
So,
seemed more conservative even than my generation.
some of my first-hand experiences, I there's quite a decent amount of us that are that like with the vaping and shit.
Oh yeah.
There's plenty of people in my school that do that.
Oh okay.
I don't do that myself, but and it's because like they're told that that vaping is different than smoking, and it doesn't actually do anything now. But now certain scientists are finding that vaping does do things all of a sudden.
Oh yeah.
People are like getting diseases from it.
Yeah, your lungs break down and shit. I know a guy who never smoked his whole life. And then when vaping came out and became popular, he like started vaping. It's like, dude, you were never a smoker. You never like smoked a cigarette in your life, and now suddenly you're just like, what, gonna take on vaping because it's fucking cool? Like, dude, like there's something wrong with you. And then plus, why would you start nicotine now? He was like, no, there's no nicotine in it. Because he was like, oh, here, try vaping. It's cool. Here, I'll let you use my spare vape pen. And I'm like, okay. He's like, yeah, it's cool. There's all flavors and shit.
That prevent that.
Well, when I took I took the first like toke of a vape pen, I was like, dude, there's nicotine in here. No, there isn't. And I'm like, yes, there is. I can taste it. It's gross. He's like, really? He's like, no, man, there's no nicotine in this. And I'm like, yeah, really? Have you checked? And he researched it, and he said, holy shit, you're right. There's like a .3 of a fucking of something of nicotine in it. And I'm like, see, I told you, I can taste it. It's disgusting. It tastes like I'm licking a fucking ashtray. So anyways, I don't know. It's fucking nasty. Like, I'm a guy who I didn't never minced it. Like, if I'm gonna do mushrooms, I'll fucking do mushrooms. If I'm gonna take acid, I'll take acid. And if I'm gonna snort a line of coke, I'll snort a line of coke. But I'm not gonna like pretend that I'm not doing what I'm doing. Like, I'm not gonna pretend that somehow it's healthy. You know? And I don't do any of that shit anymore. Like, I don't look back and you know, think, oh yeah, I was so cool doing acid in my 20s. Like, oh, that was so cool. No, it wasn't cool. It was stupid.
Yeah, listen. I mean, it's just dumb.
But we were all like, I don't know, me and my, like, there was a core group of my friends who, I never really was a drinker. I never drank much. I didn't like the taste of beer. I saw lots of my friends just boozing it up, and I'm like, fuck, you guys are idiots. Like, I don't ever want to get drunk like that, like, because you guys are out of control. So I wasn't really, I couldn't get into it, not at all. And I just didn't understand what the draw was. But I was still a self-medicator. I smoked lots of marijuana from the time I was a kid, like, from the time I was... And I think that's where a lot of my immaturity came from, was the fact that I started smoking weed when I was 13.
Yeah, that is where immaturity comes from.
Yeah. And it wasn't until I was 40 that I finally quit smoking weed. I had stopped for about 6 years.
Super cool for doing it. That's what immaturity is.
Well, and I'll tell you something, like, when I had a miserable childhood. Like, I lived with an abusive father. I didn't have my mother from the time I was 3 years old. My dad was totally abusive. And, but, so what happened was, I didn't think anything of it. When I first smoked weed, it made me laugh so much. Like, I was out of my head with laughter, and just like, we had such a good time. It wasn't a bad trip at all. And then what happened was, like, I also faced a lot of misery and shitty times. Like, things would get shitty. And I think what happened was, one day I'd probably had a row with my dad, and things were shitty. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I had a row with my dad, and things were really bad for me. And I was like, and then I just happened to, like, smoke a joint with a friend, and it made me feel better. And that's right there, I was hooked. I was like, oh shit, weed makes me feel better. And so right from the time I was 13 years old, I never had to actually learn how to deal with my problems, because I could just smoke a joint and they would all go away. And that's where, I believe that's where the addiction starts to come in. Because you think that it's going to solve your problems instead of learning to deal with your problems naturally. You rely upon this other thing to solve your problem for you. And I think that's really where I went wrong. And, like, I look back without any, like, I tried quitting weed for years and years, but, and I could stop for, say, 6 months. And then suddenly... Yeah.
What if that's part of what happened pre-flood?
What happened for what?
What if that is part...
Oh, pre-flood.
Pre-flood?
Wickedness and corruption and...
Drugs.
Yeah, drugs. Pharmaceuticals. It's all pharmaceutical based, right? It's refining stuff down to its basic elements, and then taking the basic elements. I think that's where the abuse factor comes in. So, like, if you took the coca plant, the way God made coca, if you took a leaf of the plant and you wanted the energy to climb a mountain, you'd take a leaf from the coca plant and you'd chew on it while you're hiking, and it would give you that energy, right? That's one thing. But when you take the leaf of that plant and you start breaking it down and refining it and turning it into a powder, and then you take that powder and snort it, that's where it turns into witchcraft. As soon as you go beyond just chewing on a leaf, you start to break into the territory of witchcraft. It's pharmaceuticals.
Oh yeah.
That's witchcraft. So, anyways, if you like my talk about witchcraft and and everything else overlaying the game Banished, you can like and subscribe and hit that notification bell.
Alright.
Yeah.